Hi, everyone. Understanding the way that cells work is interesting and challenging and sometimes very, very, very complex. A lot of us have been exposed to the idea of a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell. A prokaryotic cell that doesn't have a separate nucleus where it keeps the hereditary materials. It doesn't have other organelles like the mitochondria and the chloroplast. And it doesn't have a number of other cell components, and there are lots of other cell components that are different. For example, the makeup of the tails of the phospholipids that surround the cell are different between the three major domains of life. The, the way that flagella function, as well as the shape and structure of the DNA, are different in these lineages. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to explore where some of those cell parts come from in the eukaryote, because it seems clear that prokaryotic cells came first. And so we'd like to know where all this complicated cell machinery comes from. Let's start off by looking at the nucleus. So the little yellow star on this phylogeny shows the last universal common ancestor, a prokaryote that has circular chromosome that doesn't have a separate nucleus, that doesn't have membrane-bound organelles within the cell. Look down at the slightly more subtle box that says the origin of the nucleus. So this occurs at the very beginning of the eukaryotes. So we might ask ourselves, where does this nucleus come from and how does it get separated out from the rest of the cell? There's a well-known system of membrane-bound parts to the cell that are outside the nucleus as well. One of the leading hypotheses is that there was some infolding and and basically some of these structures that are folded in and help to provide some structure inside the cell to separate out some of the functions in the cell become permanent and are elaborated upon. And so this is the origin not only of the nucleus, but also of the endomembrane system that includes the endoplasmic reticulum. So the idea that the nucleus is associated with the endoplasmic reticulum has a lot of support, and the idea that they develop together has a lot of support. But there are other hypotheses too, and some of those involve trying to understand how this could be an endosymbiotic product. There's one hypothesis that people are looking at that suggests that viruses might have had a role. I think this is probably the best. This idea that an endomembrane system formed and separated out the nucleus is probably the best supported at this time, but as we know, the nature of science means that that could change. However, the mitochondria, which has the sometimes unfortunate title of the powerhouse of the cell, may have a different origin. So mitochondria essentially improve ATP availability. ATP is a molecule that helps move energy around cells and make it available to do cellular work. And essentially, mitochondria make our processing of chemical food much more efficient by allowing us to extract more ATP from each unit from that of food that comes in. So the mitochondria have an endosymbiotic origin. And while that's been proposed as a potential explanation for the nucleus, it looks like that may not be how the nucleus came about. So for mitochondria, it looks like there was another cell, likely an alpha proteobacterial cell, that began living in association with early eukaryotic cells. This alpha proteobacterium was engulfed into the eukaryotic cell. And I've got a couple of cells up here in the left to show you how that sort of might be pictured. And in fact, these images come from an intracellular bacterium that might have looked a lot like the ancestors of mitochondria. So this particular group is actually pathogenic, it's disease causing, and it's called rickettsia. These rickettsia cells, these rickettsia bacteria, are members of the alpha proteobacteria and live within cells, and it's possible that they could have entered cells in similar ways, that the ancestor of the mitochondria might have entered cells in a similar way. Another option is, or another part of the cell that we'd like to explain and understand, is the chloroplast that we find in eukaryotic photosynthesizers. So the chloroplast does oxygenic photosynthesis. That means that it releases oxygen as part of the photosynthetic process, part of harvesting light energy and storing that in chemical energy. So what's interesting about that is it does that in the same way that cyanobacteria do. We believe that the chloroplast was also endosymbiotic. And you can trace this green arrow from the cyanobacteria to the chloroplast, or to the origin of the plantae clade. The plantae clade is a nice clade in the sense that it's monophyletic. It includes the most recent common ancestors and all of the descendants, and it lumps together the land plants as well as several common ancestors, or several recent relatives of the land plants that include the glaucophyte algae, the red algae, and the green algae. So these organisms seem to have acquired a chloroplast through endosymbiosis, and we refer to this as primary endosymbiosis. So this endosymbiosis happens directly from a cyanobacterial cell that moves into a eukaryotic lineage. What's interesting is that this doesn't account for all of the chloroplasts that are part of the eukaryotes. So we need another explanation for lots of other groups. And it turns out that a eukaryotic cell was actually engulfed by other groups of eukaryotes. So a eukaryotic cell that contained chloroplasts was engulfed by other eukaryotes. So this is a secondary endosymbiosis because the ancestors of the plantae acquired a cyanobacterial-like ancestor that becomes their chloroplast. And then that happens again to their descendants, who wind up living inside of another lineage of eukaryotes. And so what's happened there is that the endosymbiotic process appears to have happened twice. Once from a bacterium into a eukaryote, and once from a eukaryote into a second eukaryote. And so over time, that engulfed cell is diminished, it loses its nucleus, it retains some components. And we can see evidence both of the original cyanobacterium as well as evidence of that eukaryote. One of the ways that we can look for that evidence is in the membrane structure around those chloroplasts. So this process probably accounts for organisms like diatoms, as shown here, euglenids, dinoflagellates, and many other groups as well, including the kelp, which are large and plant-like, but are actually considered protists and are a separate group. So they probably acquired plant-like characteristics through a completely unique origin. And and became multicellular separately. So, I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and that it helps to explain where some of the parts of the complicated eukaryotic cells have come from. Thanks for listening and have a great day.